Hello, everyone. We're giving a couple minutes for everyone to filter in. I'll say this again in a couple more, but we're probably going to be recording this for future use. So if you don't want to be in that, turn your camera off. In the meantime, if you'd like, you could introduce yourself in chat, say where you're from or what brought you here or anything else, really. I'll start. All right, well, let's get started. Alice, could you share the presentation, or is that something I should be trying to do?
I can do that, just 1 second.
Okay, of course. Thank you. Looks like we're mementoing this one, huh?
Where? Okay.
There we go. Okay. So tonight's presentation is called Why Now and Here's How. It's going to be a fairly broad at first and then specific overview of how we got to where we are, why there is a chance to pass the New York Health Act, and By why, I mean specifically within the politics and happenings of New York State, but also in a broader sense in terms of the economic and social thinking, honestly, from the beginning of American history. So we're going to start by doing some big history, talking about why these things are up in the air, why we're at a potential inflection point. After that, we're going to hear Harvey Kaye speak about historical social movements and the policies that they've passed, and connecting the struggles we have to some of the earliest struggles of America. It's pretty obvious that there's a lot of America that doesn't live up to its promises. And I want us to come away from this remembering that these promises have been made, and it's up to us to fulfill them. And that doing this is radical, but it's not new or un-American. Afterwards, we're going to hear from Jenny Hua, who is a part of the New York Doctors Coalition. And she's going to be talking about pitching as and to healthcare providers, and a little bit of the landscape of that. Afterwards, we're going to go into the specifics of the New York State political situation and what our concrete plans for pushing this forward are. So I'm going to start big picture by talking about something called neoliberalism. Alice, could you hit the slide? Great. Okay. Neoliberalism is a term that more or less means something leftists don't like, but it's more specific than that. It's the ideology we've been living in for longer than I've been born. It's, as you see in my little quote, this is why we can't have nice things. Yeah, neoliberalism is that. It's a set of economic and political positions that, well, I'll show in the next slide, came into power in the late 70s and early 80s. And it's designed to reduce government regulation and power in everything, but especially in economic activities. Neoliberalism does things like promote free trade, promote the privatization of previously public fields. It is engaged in a lot of worrying about the deficit and austerity, and it looks to deregulate things. It's the economic paradigm that all governments in the Western world really have been a part of for 40 years now. So let's talk a little bit about how we got there first off. The next slide, please. Okay, great. So for a number of reasons that I do not actually understand enough about, there was a lot of economic malaise in the 70s. This is the era of stagflation. This is when OPEC started flexing its muscle and people started realizing that oil prices and oil availability could have huge ripple effects on the economy. And things were just bad. There were institutional responses. They were slow, both in terms of acting and acting on a long time frame. So people didn't feel that the government was stepping in to fix things like soaring gasoline prices or slowing wage production. After a bunch of people tried, and no one, in terms of the popular consciousness, felt like anyone succeeded in how to fix the 70s economic issues, into the early 80s come these bold champions of neoliberalism. Margaret Thatcher was the first over in the UK, and Ronald Reagan shortly after her. Thatcher was interesting because she was very explicit about the brutal and power aspects of neoliberalism. Her slogan was, "There is no alternative." She broke up strikes with extreme violence in previous nationalized industries that she wanted to privatize, and is still a very actively hated figure among parts of the UK, especially old mining countries and counties, I guess, and other deindustrialized areas, far more than Reagan is because of the brutality with which she enforced this program. Reagan shows up as a former actor, and a lot of what he does is, he starts to work with the religious right. He's very good at messaging, but he also actively shows his hand, the hand of neoliberalism, when he said in his first inaugurational address, "Government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem." So essentially, the neoliberal worldview is one in which any government intervention in economic sectors can only lead to tyranny, and that the goal of neoliberalism is to basically make the state weaker and weaker until it disappears, and we live in a perfect anarcho-capitalist paradise where, if you want to sell yourself into slavery or sign a contract that does whatever, that's fine, as long as it's a contract. A lot of thinkers at the time believed that the left and the center left would respond to this with an energetic push back towards bread and butter economic policies, taking care of the workers. But both in Anglo and American politics, that's not at all what happened. Instead, you have Tony Blair and Clinton, who created what are generally referred to as third-way Democrats. Third-way Democrats was the start of the center-left in Anglo-American politics, abandoning economics and abandoning trying to help the working class. They acquiesced to the vast majority of changes that Thatcher and Reagan made. They didn't try to reverse them. They didn't try to renationalize. They didn't try to support the struggling workers. Instead, they did things like means testing social programs, so even fewer people could have access to it. They talked a lot about the debt and the deficit, which was a huge talking point under neoliberalism, and not one that previous left or central left parties had ever really cared about. And so that led us, if they were in power for roughly the 90s and Thatcher and Reagan for the 80s, that 1-2 punch meant there was no viable non-neoliberal policy for my entire lifetime. As Thatcher put it, she went out there saying there is no alternative, and there wasn't for a very, very long time. We're going to talk a little bit next about some of the rather brutal ways that neoliberalism was pushed outside of just these global north powerful developed countries and onto other people. The rise and the fall of the neoliberal empire is what I'm talking about, this part of it. It is a dumb pun on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, but you could make a strong case for there actually being a neoliberal empire, and I'm about to make it on the next slide. Okay, so part of the set of policies that neoliberals liked is called the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus became America's de facto response to any developing country that wanted to get on our good side and wanted aid. It required things like lowering taxes on the richest. It required trade liberalization. So no longer could countries institute tariffs to protect their growing industries. They had to open it up to the entire world. Let foreign direct investment come in. So American companies could build the means of productions that would, say, take all the oil in, Nigeria, and allow us to profit far more than the people who lived there. It suggested privatizing state elements, so anything public, we told them not to. We told them to deregulate financial markets, increase security for property rights. These were all a set of demands that developing countries needed to sign on if they wanted the help of organizations like the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, or the EU. So while the Cold War was still going on in the first decade of neoliberalism, this pushed them further away from the Soviet policies. So it really did create a bunch of client states that were clients not as much to our government and our military, but to our companies and to the wealthy and the ruling class, because suddenly there were huge trade opportunities and opportunities for the wealthy in the global north to invest heavily in the developing countries in the global south and to take the benefits of their resources and their labor and not invest in the people. So I think there is an actual argument that there was a neoliberal empire, but maybe not so much anymore. So next slide, please. Great. Okay. So I think the Great Recession killed it. I think the banking crisis and the Great Recession showed everyone how untenable this system was. We didn't quite know it at the time, but the recovery being so slow and so many people being left out of it, and also this sense that that what was happening was so convoluted and complicated and about bankers betting on things they made up that have nothing to do with anything. You combine that with the consensus view that the Obama recovery was insufficient, especially to the people who got hurt instead of the corporations. And you start to see how the Great Recession and the response to it started attacking the neoliberal consensus. I think 2016 is when it was buried more or less. There are three main points on that. Trump campaigned in 2016 on a pretty unorthodox set of economic policies for the center right, for the GOP. He campaigned against free trade. He campaigned for economic protectionism. He campaigned not caring about deficits and deficit spending. So he wanted to, spend his infrastructure week, which is still coming any week now, was going to spend $1 trillion, which no neoliberal Republican would ever have done before because they were worried about the national deficit, or said they were. Trump wanted to bring back American industries, which involved tariffs. So he wanted to put up barriers to free trade. And he talked about taking care of the middle and the working class economically. You could also see, although we'll talk about that, in terms of what he actually did as a president, I think that economic protectionism is really the only thing he actually implemented that was different. He cut taxes to the ultra wealthy, which did nothing for the majority of Americans. I guess he did ignore the deficit when he cut taxes for the ultra wealthy. He tried to make manufacturing industries come back. He technically scrapped NAFTA, but his new thing is essentially the same. So he didn't really walk the walk, but that he was talking it was important. Similarly, on the center left, you have Bernie Sanders with a explicit challenge to neoliberalism. He talked about how these policies and the retreat from the government feeling a responsibility for its citizens, because it instead is responsible for its corporations, was leaving everybody behind. And obviously, Bernie Sanders in 2016 was a shock to the people in power on the center left because of how much his message resonated. Clinton ultimately did, of course, win the nomination, but she was proposing very little. She was proposing small incremental reforms that wouldn't change the shape of things and wouldn't change the way American government thought about its responsibilities to its citizens. And that lack of energy is one of the reasons why people were willing to try Trump before they got to know him really well. There were plenty of people who were like, I'll take the devil I don't over the devil I knew. Clinton was running the same kind of economic royalty that her husband ran, which didn't work for anyone. Brexit was actually also a repudiation of neoliberalism. While Brexit support was stronger on the right in the UK, there were plenty of people on the left who saw it as a chance to get out of under the financial requirements that the EU has. The EU's commitment to neoliberal policy, specifically austerity and not going too high into deficit, really devastated the economies of a lot of South European nations. And so there were people on the left who were championing Brexit as a way to not be ruled by a coalition of neoliberal technocrats. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so like I said, I think neoliberalism is kind of on retreat right now, which is an opportunity for us to show that there's an appetite for muscular government intervention to provide social services, that people are okay with paying taxes and okay with having a government if the government does things for them, if they support their material needs. So on the right, you have this kind of civil war going on between low-key, a cold civil war maybe, in the GOP between the old establishment and new Trumpist factions. And I use that to not just mean whether Trump will stay influential or not, but this sort of ideological layers. They're, like I said, all about tariffs and having these old traditional industries being protected by the government, scrapping NAFTA, which again really didn't do anything because the trade deal they had to replace it was almost the exact same thing. Even immigration is often framed as a rejection of free trade or connected to that. There's obviously a lot of pretty horrible nativist, racist sentiment involved in the rejection of immigration, but neoliberalism championed immigration because it championed people being able to move wherever they were most productive and companies being able to outsource well. If you can't afford to pay an American worker, you can afford to pay a Chinese worker. Oh, you can't do that. How about a Bangladeshi worker? That sort of thing. So the immigration fixation on the right and the Trumpist right is tied into that, I think. On the left, we get, again, the show of force in 2020, where he, to his credit, stuck to his ideas, and they were still quite popular. And again, not popular enough to win the nomination, but enough to get people talking about them. I think one of the interesting things is that the Biden administration and what they've been doing has shown a retreat from neoliberal policies that Obama had. So Obama was desperate to keep the recovery bill for the 2008 financial crisis under $1 trillion. He thought that if it were above that price tag, then people would start screaming about the deficit and that how will the government pay back this money, and it would be enormously unpopular. So he didn't even try to get anything on support. Meanwhile, Biden passed the America Recovery Act of 2021, just under $2 trillion, spending significantly towards the lower and the middle class, working and middle classes, and nobody said anything. There were no real holdouts on the Democratic side talking about the deficit, and more importantly, the right didn't say anything either. The right media apparatus, while that bill was being voted on, was talking about Dr. Seuss and Mr. Potato Head being canceled. They stuck to cultural issues because they're beginning to feel that this sense of no, the government shouldn't ever do anything for you is a losing issue. So both the American right and the American left are kind of out at sea. The dominant ideology of economics and politics, of neoliberalism, which we've had for about 40 years now, seems to be going further and further away. And people don't really know what's next, which means it's our job to convince them that what's next is muscular government social programs, reducing the power of big capital interests and paving the way for social control of the democracy. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk briefly about why we're thinking of pushing the New York Health Act here and how we think it could connect to these larger struggles we're talking about of proving to American citizens that their government can do things for them and in fact should. So first off, one of the reasons we're doing it here is that the DSA has a local competitive advantage in New York State. We have more state legislators than we do in any other state. We have a large base of power. We have a large group of people who pay dues and show up to our rallies. And the New York Health Act also has a long history. It was introduced over 20 years ago, which has given us enough time to patch some of the holes and to fix some of the problems and to begin to work on people. That having a long institutional history really helps. So, you know, when someone says, well, what about insurance workers? They're going to be out of jobs. Well, the New York Health Act dealt with that 15 years ago, and there's a whole provision for retraining them and rehiring them into the New York Health apparatus. The other reason is simple, that Cuomo is extremely low on political capital at the moment. Cuomo runs New York State with more executive privilege, with more imperial hand than a lot of people realize. One of the things he could do is he has pretty unilateral control over the budget process and uses that to cause reprisals against legislators who bother him. So for a while, we were looking to get the 26th Senate sponsor. But if we got that, then it would maybe go to vote. And if it went to vote, Cuomo would have to veto it because, of course, he's ideologically obsessed with neoliberalism, completely inflexible, which would make him look bad. So anyone who made him look bad would suffer reprisals. So we had a bunch of people saying, yeah, I'm interested, but can't come out in favor of it yet. Except Cuomo's weak now. And this year, when it was reintroduced, we have 33 co-sponsors. So 8 people wanted to vote for this in the New York Senate and didn't because they were afraid of Cuomo. They're not afraid of Cuomo right now. That's an advantage. Okay. One more slide. And this is how we think of it as fitting into the big picture of Medicare for all nationally, sometimes called the Canada model. Healthcare reforms usually often start locally before going nationally. Obamacare, the ACA, was Romney Care in Massachusetts before it went national. It was cooked up by a conservative think tank. I think the American Enterprise Institute years before as a free market alternative to socialized healthcare, which should also tell you something about the kind of political ideology that Obama ran under. In Canada, we had a similar situation where in Saskatchewan, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation Farmer Labor Socialist Party passed a public health care program in 1962. They had introduced insurance assistance about 15 years earlier, but this was the first, we're going to pay everyone for healthcare. The doctors went on strike, private doctors went on strike, which lasted about 3 weeks and went nowhere, and everyone kind of reverted to status quo. This was seen as so successful so quickly that only 4 years later, the national government of Canada started directing funds for other provinces to set up similar programs. And then a little less than 20 years later, they put an even more heavy hand on it, and they said that these programs, if you want these funds, they can't be having service fees, and any extra billing is illegal. So basically Saskatchewan did it. Canada said, hey, that's pretty good. And over time, the law got stronger and stronger. Once a universal program is in play, it's hard to take it away from people. The neoliberals, especially on the right, have been trying to reform Social Security and Medicare out of existence basically since it passed, and they've totally failed. It's a wildly popular service. All right, so that's my little spiel for now, and we're going to go to Harvey K, who's going to talk about some of the history of previous big, bold political policies to show us that social support is an American tradition and to see what we can learn from the connection between social movements and policies.
Okay, for a start, I would actually stick the word democracy in there. Social democracy is an American tradition. I think social support may well be, but social democracy would probably work better. And I just want to say that I'm really excited. Had no idea how close New York was to securing a single payer or a sort of statewide national healthcare kind of program. And I think actually, if you guys can actually push this through, this would be a radical moment. It would really make a difference nationally. And I say that because if you think about it right now, Cuomo's in trouble and Newsom in California is in trouble. And there are a lot of, however much it seems like liberals and progressives are rallying around Newsom, there's a lot of serious questioning of the Newsom governorship in California, in good part because he had promised a statewide healthcare plan and had not fulfilled it, among many other things. So it may well be that we're at I think in fact it was Keith who gave me the term, an inflection point, okay? We literally could shift the balance in favor of a national wave of social democratic action. But before I get too excited about all this, I want to go back a little bit to what Keith was talking about regarding the 1970s, fill a little bit in and explain to you that we really have seen a 45, almost a 50-year, but especially a 45-year plus, for lack of a better way of putting it, class war on American democracy. And specifically, this has been a war on the legacy of the 1930s FDR New Deal and the legacy of the 1960s Great Society years, which were really premier moments for advancing social democratic politics and policies in the United States. And just to help Keith's story a little bit, one of the reasons that the 70s was so trying for American business was sort of twofold. On the one hand, American industry for the first time in decades faced serious competition because the recovery from the war by Japan and Germany, which we assisted, was now making, if you like, it was called a profit squeeze, a compression. That is, you had automobile companies competing with each other, not only the big three in the United States and the smaller ones as well, which have disappeared, but also you had, the likes of the German and Japanese automakers. So there was this profit squeeze. So on the one hand, capital, big industry really did feel this kind of squeeze. And on the other hand, because of the social movements of the 60s, which included everything from Ralph Nader's revelation, what he revealed about business practices in the pharmaceutical industry and the automobile industry. You also had the anti-war movement, which raised serious questions about American war profiteering in the war and the kinds of weapons that were let loose. I've just blanked on the term napalm, for example, in that war. So, and on top of that, and this is really in some ways the most fundamental, you had the struggles on the part of liberals and progressives that brought about voting rights, civil rights, and these are from the bottom up in many ways, Medicare, Medicaid, radical immigration reform, since America had not reformed immigration since the 1924 very highly, extremely restrictive Immigration Quota Act. There was also the enactment of laws regarding environmental, marketplace, and workplace protections. So business, at the same time as it's being squeezed by competition, is also being compelled to endure, as they thought, greater organization of labor, including public employee unionism, demands that every area of industry be better regulated. And in 1971 through 1975, a series of, for lack of a better term, declarations of war were issued against the democratic forces. And the best example I can give you, and whenever anybody mentions this particular group, if anyone even has heard of them, immediately conspiracy theories, seem to come into people's minds. But there was no conspiracy theory in any of this. They were very open business. David Rockefeller, head of the Chase Manhattan Bank, was calling on bankers to face up to the pressure. Sorry. Oh, okay. Then you got the Lewis Powell Memorandum. Lewis Powell was a major lawyer from Virginia who issued a memorandum to the Chamber of Commerce, telling them of all the forces, environmentalists and others who were challenging businesses' capacity to do what it pleased, okay, to advance American capitalism. But then one of the most telling things is there was issued in 1975 by a group called the Trilateral Commission, which was organized by David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a professor at Harvard, who became eventually the Secretary of State for Jimmy Carter. Carter was a coalition of business and political figures from Western Europe, the United States, and Japan. And they issued this report, The Crisis of Democracy, which was published, by the way, by NYU Press. So this is by no means a conspiracy document or anything like that. And in this, they said that the West, especially the United States, was suffering from not simply a crisis of democracy, but an excess, their own words, of democracy. And it was imperative to dampen down the democratic spirit. There was just too much democracy. And they actually named their enemies, or if they didn't use the word enemies, but they named the culprits, the people who needed to be, if you like, diffused of their sentiments. So that included labor unions, the Poor People's Movement, minority rights campaigners, women's movement, student movements. They went right down the line and named all of these. And then they said, but of course, really, a big part of the problem was the liberal media. And these were supposedly, by the way, the more liberal corporate interests, and what they called value-oriented intellectuals, AKA humanities and social science professors, who were becoming all the more vocal as sort of what we today call public intellectuals, and basically challenging the cultural domination of big business. So they issued this. Now, none of the groups that I've mentioned so far could really mobilize a popular base. However, at that point, we get the entrance of what came to be called the New Right. And this was, the champion of the New Right was Ronald Reagan. The coalition included a whole host of right-wing interest groups. Probably their greatest base was the evangelical Christians, who were so basically exploding as a political force in the 70s. Their numbers not necessarily increased, but up until the 70s, they had voted Democratic. They were not a politicized force in the way they became, but they were eager to defend their all-white Christian schools in the South. And if they weren't in these all-white Christian schools, the prayer in schools, and they wanted to literally crush the right to an abortion. So you get these forces that come together. And of course, so the New Right becomes rather ascendant. Now, seriously speaking, they declared war, both the corporate interests and this New Right coalition of business and populist politics. They declared war on workers' rights, on women's rights, and on the rights of people of color, especially African Americans. In other words, workers' rights, women's rights, and they targeted voting rights. In spite of the Voting Rights Act having been passed in the 60s, ever from the day after that act went into effect, they pursued war on the Voting Rights Act. So what we get is a really extraordinary challenge to what had been from the 1930s through to the very beginning of the 70s, what was sometimes called the liberal consensus. And the most depressing aspect is that the Democrats in 1976, little did the popular vote realize it, chose as their candidate Jimmy Carter. Now, I know a lot of people have a soft spot in their heart for Jimmy Carter, but Jimmy Carter is actually the godfather of neoliberalism, not Ronald Reagan. Jimmy Carter instituted, in 1978, he basically declared his own war on all of the forces I've just mentioned, when he gave a series of speeches. One was called the Malaise speech. Another one is the place where the word austerity is entered into the political rhetoric. And what he said is we have to deregulate, reduce taxes, and I don't think I'm exaggerating. I wrote quite a bit on this in my books. He might even have said we have to liberate business, okay? Which basically meant everyone else has got to pay for it, okay? We're gonna have to, we're gonna have to basically well, he did actually deregulate. He began the deregulation of finance and the deregulation of transportation. He also did nothing to help labor reform the Taft-Hartley Act, which had been a promise of the Democrats for years and years and years. He also turned his back on the consumer rights movement that Nader had fostered back in the 60s. So anyhow, what we get is this 45-year war. Now, again, I said it was a war on what had been a kind of liberal consensus, but seriously speaking, it was actually a social democratic consensus. And I do want you to know, don't let people tell you that Americans turned on the social democratic ideals or even the ideals of civil rights and voting rights. They didn't. Every poll that was taken, every major survey, which generally was ignored by the media through the 70s and even into the 80s, the Reagan years, indicated that Americans wanted more of what the New Deal and the Great Society had been about. The Democrats themselves were so determined to regain power, they turned their back on their own base, okay, the working class. And as a consequence, the working class as a class has probably not seen a rise in their real wages since 1971, 72, or 73. Okay, so now I want to get to the significance of why I'm here, perhaps, and that is the war on the social democratic politics of the 30s through the 60s was not simply a political and an economic campaign. It was very much an ideological, or more significantly, the term culture war is most appropriate, because they were determined. This is evident in the 70s. Even, I mean, I got my PhD in the 70s and we could see it happening. We could see it happening. They declared war on American memory, okay? Americans had come through the 30s to the 60s. They had believed in that government can be a tremendous force for good, that human rights, that American rights should be human rights, that Americans should have. Now, I'll just mention, jumping ahead a bit, in 1944, when Franklin Roosevelt, in a State of the Union message, basically proclaimed the possibility of an economic Bill of Rights, which included the right of all Americans to health care. He did so not only because he believed in it himself, going back decades, but also because in 1943, the White House had run polls asking Americans what they wanted after the war. They wanted to know, did they want to see a revival of the New Deal, okay? And what they discovered, and I won't go through all the figures, I'll go right to the heart of our matter tonight. 85% of Americans wanted guaranteed national health care. And that was 75% of Republicans and 95% of Democrats. And the right and reactionaries, they took notice and they went to war on that very idea. Even after Roosevelt's death, Harry Truman tried to secure national health care. But conservative Republicans, period, okay, and Southern Democrats represented a major conservative coalition. Even if whatever they felt about each other on other issues, they both opposed the idea of national health care. The Republicans up north, because they despised the idea of expanding the public, or if you like, the Commonwealth, and they were really speaking on behalf of corporate interests and even Main Street, not only Wall Street interests. Southern Democrats were just basically white supremacists. Southern Democratic voters would love to have had national health care. However, the white supremacist senators, who, by the way, as you can imagine, because of seniority systems in Congress, really chaired so many committees, they opposed it, and they campaigned alongside of corporate interests, basically because they did not want to desegregate hospitals. Simple as that. They knew that national health care as a federal law and series of programs would be hostile, undermining, subversive and literally would have declared segregation in healthcare unconstitutional. Okay, and there were other Supreme Court decisions around that time that showed the degree to which the courts, which had begun to move to the left under Roosevelt, would probably find any other kind, they outlawed a certain kind of covenant in housing that would have been racially or religiously based. So, okay, my point is they declared war on American memory. So how many Americans had even heard, by the way, how many Americans ever heard of the Economic Bill of Rights speech of 1944 that FDR proposed? How many people know that Harry Truman tried to secure national health care and it was blocked? How many people know that from 1943 all the way through the 50s, a supposedly conservative period, into the 60s, there was never a time in which less than 50% of Americans wanted to guarantee health care to all Americans, okay? So, but the declaration of war that was pursued, the war that was pursued on American memory sought to eliminate any kind of recognition that from the very beginnings of the American story, independent American story, that social democracy had been a part of the story. So for example, how many people realize that the fellow, my hero, by the way, Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, which was the first really public call for the break with Britain, separation, independence, not only called for independence, it also called for the establishment of a democratic republic. And that very same Thomas Paine, the pamphleteer, would go on when he ends up back in Europe, where I won't go through the whole story of why he was in Europe at the time, but he gets involved in the French Revolution and the British labor struggle for democratic rights. And he writes two pamphlets that begin the story of social democracy. One is Rights of Man, and the other is Agrarian Justice. And he literally lays out initiatives of a public sort that anyone today would recognize as social democratic or even democratic socialism. And the best example was in Agrarian Justice, where he said, you tax the landed rich. Tax the landed rich because God intended the world for all to share and they monopolize too much of it. Tax them and you can create a fund that will give money grants to young people when they reach the age of maturity, 16 or 18, to give them a start in life, and will also allow for the creation of what we came to know of as Social Security, that at the age of seniority, people should not have to labor any longer, and they should receive an old age pension, Social Security. So right from the beginning, here's this American revolutionary who was already, and by the way, these were very, very popular pamphlets as well back in the United States, though he had published them first in Europe. Then you can even go on and think about the series of movements, which I'll come back to, but I want to go more importantly to two of them. Everyone knows when asked who the two greatest presidents in American history were. They often throw Washington in, but they forget that his greatest moments might have been before he was even president. The two greatest presidents were Lincoln and Roosevelt. Now everyone says, well, Lincoln led us through the war and FDR led us through World War II and we won. But what they don't consider is that even in the midst of the war in which slaves themselves had enabled and encouraged and propelled Lincoln to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, in the very same year that he's doing that, he's also signing the Land Grant Act into law, which creates public higher education, basically free. I mean, it's so low cost on the part of the students to attend. Men and women can secure higher education, not have to go to a private institution, public higher education, as well as the Homestead Act, which took so much of the land, say in the Midwest and out into the Plain States, and turned them into family farms, basically as grants to workers in the East or immigrants. So, I mean, Lincoln is really, and I could name a whole bunch of other stuff, Lincoln is really a pioneering social democrat, and not simply, as it's often said in the history books, the great emancipator. Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s is primed to pursue a social democratic agenda. And given the force of labor and their enthusiasm for Roosevelt, they end up pushing him perhaps even faster and further than he might have gone. And we saw not only by way of all the New Deal alphabet soup programs, a dramatic transformation in the American environment, improvement in the American environment, a massive improvement in the American national infrastructure. We often drive through tunnels and ride over bridges and ride on roads. We go to libraries, we go to post offices, we go to schools. Quite often, these were built under the New Deal. I mean, I know New York City well, and it often amazes me how many times you can go into a major post office facility and you'll see it's, you know, New Deal construction, so on. And then also consider Social Security itself, okay? You can't do any better. And FDR wanted to include healthcare as part of Social Security. The major force stymieing that was the American Medical Association. They had no intention of giving up any of their authority, and they, you know, or for that matter, being subject to federal regulation of any sort. He empowers labor, and by the way, this was incredibly important, the empowerment of working people at the time, because it's that empowerment which outlives his own life. I mean, it outlives his administration, which ended in 45. It literally drives the 1960s social democratic reforms, because as I've told people before, at the age of 50, if you think of the so-called greatest generation, the young people who were 15 years old in 1935, who went off to war in their 20s in the 1940s, they're now, if you think 35 to 65, they're now 45 years old. They remember well FDR's call for the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, and his proposal, his vision of an economic Bill of Rights. So one of the reasons I figured that Keith, and last week Noah had asked me to speak, is not just to give you a history lesson. It's this. It's to realize that when we struggle for social democratic programs, and there is no more desired social democratic program today than what Bernie called Medicare for All, what might be called, I think it's called the New York Health Plan, is it not, or the New York Health Act? These are the kinds of things, that seem self-evident to us as public goods. We should secure them. What we have to realize is they are fundamentally a part of the American story. They stand on the shoulders, we stand on the shoulders of generations who fought for Medicare and Medicaid, before that for Social Security. And I can add all that. So I think they called me in, and this is the way I interpreted it, to give you a kind of, since we're in the age of the pandemic, a shot in the arm of the American spirit, and to remind you that you're empowered not only by the moment, by Cuomo's weakness, by the Democrats' capacity to sign on, by the, if you like, this immediate possibility, we're also empowered by generations of struggle. And I know you can't tell everyone that on the telephone or out on the street, but you can feel it, I think. And I could tell you more, but that's the kind of thing that I think it'd be great to embrace. The left has for too long turned its back on American history and left it up to conservatives and reactionaries to wrap themselves in the flag. And as FDR once said, they don't even know what the flag represents, okay?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, you got why I asked you here, and I'm glad to share it with these people. All right, so next up, I'm going to have Jenny.
Just one other thing quickly. I'm sorry.
Sure.
I left out a lot. So if anybody has any question in the course of the next set of period, just don't hesitate to ask, okay?
Yeah, if you want, you could put your email in the chat, and people can get to you if they have any further questions. There also might be.
Yeah, I'll also, for future reference, if anybody needs to contact me, I am putting my, I'll tell you what, yeah, since this is an academic thing, I think I can put my university email in.
All right. Well, next up, I'm asking Jenny Clark to talk a little bit. Jenny is a double doctor, MD, PhD, working with the New York Docs Coalition. And I'm asking her to talk about her experiences pitching to healthcare providers, and as a healthcare provider, ways of bringing that in, and talking a little bit about the challenges and maybe the opportunities of the sort of medical strategic landscape. Because as we saw, Saskatchewan immediately, there was a doctor strike, but they got on board and they were pretty happy afterwards. So let's hear what someone on the ground has to say.
Thanks, Keith. Yes, and not only did they get on board, but apparently the month that the doctors went on strike had lower mortality overall. So that goes to show something. Anyways, so I'm gonna share some slides if that's okay. All right. So, I mean, this is not really my specialty. I don't consider myself to be very good at convincing doctors, even though I am a doctor or, you know, worked until very recently as a physician. But here we go. Just to get things started, let's start with a quiz question. As a result of the Affordable Care Act, which of the following went down? You can just feel free to put your answer in the chat. A, premiums, B, deductibles, C, copay, D, out-of-pocket healthcare costs, or E, none of the above. Should not be too challenging. And I see, let's see. So E is the correct answer. So why should doctors support the New York Health Act? So the New York Health Act increases coverage and actually overall payment for physicians, but increases coverage for patients. And really, you know, if we look at what happened after the passage of the Affordable Care Act, deductibles went up, premiums went up, actually went up at several times the rate of inflation as well as wages. And if we take a look at, you know, what the ACA actually accomplished, it, for the most part, added a lot of people to this turquoise colored category, which is the underinsured category, as in their out-of-pocket cost is over 10 times that of income or over 5 times if they are in the low income bracket or they have high deductibles. But really, the blue category of people who are insured all around are not underinsured has not changed since prior to the passage of the Affordable Care Act. So I think that's quite a remarkable fact that doesn't nearly get emphasized enough. And, you know, if we look at putting it together with what Keith was alluding to in terms of there being a shift in the 1980s, so we see in the 1980s, this is a recent study by a large group of public health epidemiologists under the Lancet Commission on Public Health in the Trump era. Hopefully lots of people have already seen the study, but it does a very comprehensive overview. But, you know, since the, before the early 80s, basically the United States was middle of the pack among the G7 nations in terms of overall life expectancy. And by 2017, this really dramatically changed, right? So it started to kind of peel away from the pack after the early 1980s. By 2017, for first time 3 years in a row, you had a life expectancy actually decline in the US. And we see that there's this gap between average life expectancy in the US compared to the other 6 G7 nations. And this gap amounts to about 500,000 excess deaths. So people who die early than if they would have if they lived in one of those other 6 countries. And of course, you have to remember that this is all before the COVID pandemic, and who are in this category of people who are at, you know, 4 to sometimes even 8% the risk of dying in comparison to other G7 nations. Of course, they're predominantly African-American, BIPOC, you know, indigenous people. And white Americans also face an increased risk of dying by living in the US. Okay, so we get to improve physician satisfaction afterwards, but so it's clear that for many years, all the people who are watching the statistic unfold and looking at all other signs in the system has agreed for a long time that the system is broken, and we need to see pretty dramatic change take place. But, you know, another argument that often gets presented when our group, Physicians for National Health Plan, give talks to doctors is that physicians see improved satisfaction potentially from passage of a single payer system, which is centrally administered, right? So if you look at the US compared to other countries, US physician satisfaction is lower than countries that have a single payer system, significantly in Canada. This graph, what this shows is the number of, EPIC is an electronic health record system. So this is number of electronic health record notes inputted into EPIC across all these different countries. And you can see that in this bar chart, the US is way off the pack in terms of how many notes physicians put in on average. And all this is largely because of billing, right? So all the other countries, basically less than 2,000. US, looks like on average like 4,500, so twice that many, right? So yeah, this is mostly for billing purposes. And over the years, physician support for single payer Medicare for all type plan has increased. 49% for versus 40% against in 2002 versus 59% for. And looking at more up-to-date data and somewhat different numbers, 58% oppose in 2008 in comparison with 56% supporting in 2017. And these numbers, I don't know, I don't want to put too much credence in them because these are poll results and they're sampling errors. But another thing that we want to hammer home, and this is based on data from the third-party RAND Corporation study on the impact of the Affordable Care of the New York Health Act, published in 2018. And basically what this shows is that they crunch the numbers and shows that it's mainly you are seeing savings to the tune of $11.4 billion, or about 4% of the total healthcare spending. And much of this contribution is coming from reduced insurance administration cost. And that more than covers for actually improved provider fees, so increased reimbursement to physicians, as well as coverage of services such as long-term care, which is currently only covered under Medicaid. So I guess kind of talking now more about the nuts and bolts of organizing among physicians, some of the challenges and opportunities. So challenges, so the physicians really, as we stand, as it stands, are not a very political bunch, right? So they are significantly less likely to vote than lawyers, teachers, or even farmers. And I think this is also significant in light of the fact that some of the most, sympathetic or potentially politically actionable group are residents, right? So residents are paid, their salary comes from CMS, they are paid by public dollars, they see a variety of different settings of the, they work at a variety of different settings under the healthcare system. They do a lot of the work in public hospitals. But because in 1976, there was a big strike at Cook County Hospital, afterwards, the National Labor Relations Board classified residents as students rather than employees. This was overturned in 1999, but it has meant that it's been very difficult, especially with successive right-wing administrations in this country, to organize residence-based unions. But I'm happy to say that in New York City, Committee of Interns and Residents, or CIR, does have a pretty significant presence, and we do a lot of organizing with them. Another problem that I think it doesn't get talked about nearly enough is that since the 1960s, we see increased specialization in the medical profession. So proportionately, we have fewer doctors in primary care and preventative services. And increased specialization also means that doctors as a group might have economic interests tied to very inefficient healthcare, health insurance systems. And their revenue actually depends on what's called a fee-for-service model. And we might not be able to get too much into it, but that's a very important fact to keep in mind. So this just kind of puts some numbers on what I'm talking about. So you see that in the 1960s, you have about 10% of physicians entering internal medicine going into subspecialties being like cardiology, pulmonology, oncology. By 2015, that's become 88%, so the vast majority, right? And what that means is that the number of primary care physicians in the US since 2015 has declined to something like 33% of all physicians altogether. Whereas in 1961, I think it's more like 50%, right? So compared to like Canada and the UK, the US is skewed towards specialists. This is a very, very untenable situation. And, if you look in terms of salaries and who votes for what party, I mean, this is kind of a fun exercise, right? Like let's see if I can use the laser pointer. Does everyone see my laser pointer? Okay, so yeah, so like surgeons, very Republican. Of course, they break down into like orthopedics, surgery. These are all surgical subspecialties. So, these are the big money makers. Dermatology, big money maker. I mean, it's a pretty strong correlation. I haven't done a regression for this, but I think it looks to me like a pretty strong correlation in terms of how much money you make and how likely you are to vote for Republicans, right? And, of course, down here you have like internists, ID docs, and that correlates pretty well with who are on the more democratic side of the spectrum too. Right, so and this chart also, this is based on American Medical Association, so trade group statistics, so they might very well have a skewed sample, but I think they surveyed like 3,500 physicians who are active in practice. And just to show, over time, since the passage of the ACA, you do have a decline in how much physicians' revenue is made up by fee-for-service, right? What fee-for-service basically encourages, you get paid for how much care you provide, right? How much treatment you give. So the more you do, the more money you make, and you don't get rewarded for talking to someone for 20 minutes and convincing them to change their lifestyle, right? So this is really a way to incentivize procedures, treatments, tertiary treatments, rather than primary preventive services. And you see that overall there's a decline, but even still, even today, you see about 70% of physicians' revenue out of the 80% of physicians who work in a fee-for-service setting, 70% of that revenue is generated through fee-for-service. So doesn't get emphasized enough, but the New York Health Act actually does promote a movement away from fee-for-service payment schedule towards something more like capitated payments or global budgeting. And this is something that I'm happy to say that the current iteration of the Medicare for All bill also moves towards, right? So, okay, so I talked about the challenges, right? So I think as a group, physicians, some of them like internists, preventive, pediatricians certainly, I think, have their values and interests reflected by a single payer. Some of the others may not so much, right? Opportunities. So this is like difficult to summarize because we're still living in this historical moment, but the pandemic, I do think, is an opportunity. Speaking from someone who was working at a large, not-for-profit, but certainly private hospital in New York City at the height of the pandemic in spring, when we were seeing how overnight our work conditions transformed and we had very little negotiating power, right? And was it surprising that we had no PPE and still had to go to work? Not at all. But did it open up a moment for residents to really actually talk to each other, offline, beyond the scrutiny of their programs, to try to organize for even something like a union, which usually doesn't ever get talked about? I'm happy to say that it actually did, right? And I am putting this article in there. Eric Bessman is actually my chief resident. So he wrote this article about how important it is for residents to form a union, right? And I think the climate, I can say that there was a gestalt shift of some kind, when the pandemic hit. Even though work on the ward became more difficult than ever in some respects. there was actually a sense of solidarity and of purpose, right? And that doesn't happen very often, unfortunately, in medical practice. Also, I think issues around racism, that has also been very provocative for organizing within the medical infrastructure. And I just want to bring up one example. Students across New York City are pushing for their hospitals to actually sign up for a bill that would reallocate the indigent care pool portion of Medicaid dollars, which currently goes to hospitals that see like 5 Medicaid patients a year and only caters to the wealthy for the most part. And so it's a very unfair allocation scheme that medical students are really driving this. And because medical students are they pay tuition. So unlike employees, unlike residents, I think sometimes they unexpectedly have more say over institutional behavior. So this is a really exciting effort that we're a part of, New York Docs is a part of, but it's really driven by medical students. And finally, I guess just like a shameless plug for New York Docs, we are an organization that was established in 2016 after the election of Trump. And what we do is like multi-issue organizing. So even though most of the people who attend our weekly meetings are physicians, I'm happy to say that there's a healthy group who are non-physicians. Of course, you don't have to be physicians to attend, absolutely not. And I think the fact that we are able to organize around a multiplicity of issues really drives home the point that we need to see systemic change, right? And recently, I'll get into that, the housing activism and stuff. But yeah, and then in terms of physician outreach specifically, PNHP at New York Metro has this physician outreach tool to get 10,000 physicians to sign for the New York Health Act. And 10,000 physicians would be about 1/5 of all the practicing physicians in New York State. So that would be quite a remarkable feat. And we're also collecting stories for doctors to, and for everyone, for constituents, for patients, for consumers. But, New York Docs is working with the campaign to kind of curate stories from physicians and trainees and push these towards legislators and show them how big the problem is on the ground. And finally, this is just something that's happening, I think, as we speak. The Compassionate New York agenda, I'm sure DSA also has involvement here, but basically New York Docs is kind of involved with all of these groups, I'm happy to say. So I think it really shows that, like Audre Lorde said, there's no such thing as single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. So just how synergistic all these issues all turn out to be at the end of the day. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you guys, and happy to take any questions.
Jenny, that was so much and so great and so stark information. You're very good at data visualization and contextualization, and you went through a lot very quickly. That was fire. Please email me that presentation if you get a second. Yeah, all right. Well, so hopefully now we have a sense of where we are, where we came from. We have a sense of the medical strategic landscape. Now I'm going to move back to the slides and into the political strategic landscape. So that's slide 11. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. Okay. So the big takeaway is that we are closer than we've ever been to passing the Health Act. Like I said, it's been around for 20 years, and we've never had majority support in both chambers. We have majority support in both chambers. On paper, we have the vote. There's still a lot to be done, but that is huge. In addition to this, like I said, part of the reason we have the numbers is that Cuomo is the weakest that he's ever been. You could see it in so Cuomo essentially has time and time again signaled his really, like, I think almost pathologically inflexible obsession with neoliberal ideology, and he utterly refused to consider raising any taxes in any circumstances. Tax the Rich is a coalition group in the Invest in Our New York coalition, pushed to have the ultra wealthy invest more in New York. And while they didn't get everything, they did get a millionaire tax, a new tax that Cuomo had long been saying he would never do. He was unable to beat them back. He, blocked some of it, but not all of it. So considering that we have the votes and that Cuomo is the weakest he probably ever will be, we are trying to get this passed this session. This legislative session started in the winter, but really got started April 1st, or actually a little later, when the budget was passed. Before that, it was all budget. So we have now until June 10th. And our goal is to get a floor vote and to get the New York Health Act passed before June 10th. We want to strike while the iron is hot, while our opponents are disorganized, and before Cuomo can rebuild his political capital, which is probably going to happen. I'd love to see him weak forever or gone, but who knows? Dude's like a cockroach. And I don't mean that insultingly. Cockroaches are amazing species. In fact, I'm sorry for insulting cockroaches, but comparing them to Cuomo. Okay, so next slide. Okay. The first thing we're trying to do is, well, everything we're trying to do is using the tactics of our inside-outside strategy. Inside-outside is DSA jargon in the sort of intellectual Jacobin and the people talking about how best the DSA can use our version of power, where we want to both work on individual lawmakers, we want to pressure them, we want to lobby them, but also we want to organize communities, we want to build enduring connections between local groups and local people and get people who have been turned out of politics engaged and active. So inside is working within the legislation, outside is working to organize the constituents, essentially. And overall, our message to everyone, lawmakers and not, inside and outside, is that in order for there to be a fair, just recovery from COVID-19, we must pass and enact the New York Health Act. That what we've seen over the past year has shown to anyone who's looking, even people who don't support our policies, that it's what we have is not working, that our system is confusing and expensive and gives us bad outcomes, and that there needs to be change. And the change that has the most support, that has the longest structure, that has the best, reports, and that is the most fair and just, is the New York Health Act. So that's what we're trying to do. Strategically, we're going to begin by turning people who are supporters, legislators, who are supporters of the New York Health Act into active champions for it. We want people who already have their votes to be talking about it, to be talking to their colleagues about it, to be talking to the press about it, to be talking to the leadership about it. We want them annoying people at lunch. We want them telling their staffers to tell other staffers. We want them writing op-eds, mentioning it at events and speeches. We want people who are solidly with us to be more than just, of course you have my vote. We want them to be talking about it nonstop. Of course, at the same time as we're doing that, we're also working to flip even more lawmakers. 33 votes is great, more is better. And there are, we've recently flipped a few, we flipped our Buffalo chapter, flipped one of their senators, and we have a targeting list of who to get more. And these kind of combine to create a sense of momentum. As the lawmakers who are already with us are getting more and more excited and talking about it more and more, and as people who have been on the fence are coming on board, it will start to seem like there is a wave sweeping the legislative chambers of New York State for the New York Health Act. So next slide, please. Okay. So here's a little bit more of a breakdown of how we're going at both this first target and then the next targets we'll be talking about. Again, like I said, inside, outside. Inside is about developing experienced lobbyists and doing lobby days. So all of a sudden, tons of constituents show up and tell their lawmaker, I need this. My family will die without this. We are going to be training up people to be sharing their narrative of the problems they've encountered with the current healthcare system. We'll be offering political support, boosting messages, helping research for op-eds for people who are interested, hosting events where politicians can speak, making it as easy as possible for someone who cares about this to have time to say publicly how much they care for it. There's a program that we're working on with our coalition partners to recruit, train, and promote individual grassroots organizers in key districts for the key targets we're going after, either to flip or to get from sort of passive support into active championship. And part of that is we're especially looking at people who represent vulnerable New York populations, things like essential workers who have healthcare, immigrants, Spanish-speaking New Yorkers, lots of different groups that can represent the human cost of who gets left out and, I mean, ultimately killed even by our healthcare system the way it is now. Our outside group is about on the ground organizing in our districts. It sounds a little brutal to say, especially to the people who are our friends, but the goal of outside group is especially to convince politicians that circumstances in their districts are such that they have no choice but to be enthusiastic supporters of the New York Health Act. So that involves rallies, phone banking, canvassing, and tabling. Again, we want to turn citizens, even citizens who agree with us, into active community supporters and have them figure out who they could help recruit, organize, and train, how they could direct the movement, what local organizations they could work with. All right, so after we have a few champions, we're moving on to stage 2 and the next slide. All right, now we get into committees of jurisdiction. When I first started getting involved in the DSA, I thought it was kind of funny how obsessed we were about our proceduralism. I thought it was, cute. But as I've gotten involved more in the actual levers of power, it has become blindingly obvious that proceduralism has an insane power over American politics. If you've been following federally, the parliamentarian deciding what we couldn't put as budget reconciliation bills essentially is what things the Democratic majority can or cannot pass. Things like that happen on the state level too. So we need to get things in and through the Committee of Jurisdiction, and we're hoping to do this in May, late May, so a floor vote can happen before June 10th session. We're trying to get, so a committee is a smaller group with a certain self-selecting membership that debate bills and decide if they're ready to be passed on to the floor. The New York Health Act has to pass through 3 of those. Those are the Health Committee, the Codes Committee, and the Ways and Means Committee. When they go into the committee essentially when their authors feel that they're ready. So that's Assemblyman Gottfried and Senator Rivera. So part of what we're doing here is convincing the rank and file legislators. So the authors of the bill realize that now is the time, and realize that the less experienced or just the less previously engaged lawmakers are demanding it. And once they realize how much of both inside their colleagues and outside on the street, there is a demand for this, they'll realize that it's time to bring them to committee, and they'll bring their considerable resources and experience and networks to bear at that moment. It's kind of on us to get them to realize that now is the time, but when they do, they're big guns, they will be great allies, and they will fight tirelessly for it. All right, stage 3. Next slide, please. we need a floor vote. They could get through the committee, and if it's not called to the floor vote, it can never be voted on, and it can never pass into law. So we're going to be working on Carl Hastie, who's the Speaker of the Assembly, and Andrea Stewart-Cousins, who's the Majority Leader of the New York State Senate. These are the targets that we have been kind of working on for a while, directing phone calls to them, but they really come into play once the bill is in committee. It goes back and forth over who has more to lose and therefore who's a little more hesitant. Right now, it might be Hastie's that we're targeting a little stronger. They're both, establishment Democrats who aren't probably naturally ideologically aligned, but also could see this as a huge historic win and would love to have their names attached to the legislator that actually passed it. So they're on the fence, and it's our job to move them off it. Next slide, please. Okay. So like I said, we've been pressuring Hastie's and Stewart-Cousins, and we're just not going to vote. This is a low boil maneuver. We're going to keep them hearing from their constituents until overall we get their rank and file legislators, and then the author of the bill and the committee, and eventually they will have no choice. We can never let them forget that this is an important bill that they can pass and that will look great for them. Basically, once the bill's in committee, they'll have no real choice. That's how we're seeing it. Again, inside, we're going to be using the legislative champions we've developed over the next month or so, along with Gottfried and Rivera. We're going to give them plenty of opportunities like town halls and events and rallies and op-eds to get the message out, to speak, and to share their enthusiasm. Outside, again, it's things like community leaders, phone banking and rallies, basically the usual stuff we've been doing, but now laser focused on Hastie's and Stewart-Cousins. So demonstrations in their district, organizing among their direct constituents, that sort of thing is the little tweak we're doing in this final bit. And then once we have them, we bring it to the floor vote, and we vote and we pass it. Next slide, please. Great. So overall, our communication strategy for this entire process is first convincing people that we could do this, that now is not just, it's not just possible, but this is our best opportunity to do it. So I broke that down into sort of a moral argument and a political argument. Morally, anyone paying attention needs to know that change is necessary, that the pandemic has shown how deadly the disparities in our healthcare can be, how brutal and unjust our healthcare system is set up right now, and there must be something otherwise. Politically, we're emphasizing that we have the votes, that our opposition has not gotten clued into us yet, and that the establishment defenders of the status quo are weak, and that there's of course a lot of benefits to being one of the men or women who push this through. In addition to that, we're talking about trying to show that we can lead the way. Some of that is New York can lead the way nationally. New York as a model could prove that single payer healthcare can work in America. And so the fight for the New York Health Act actually helps the fight for healthcare for all. But in addition to that, we're showing that our wing of the democratic ecosystem is strong and growing stronger and gaining momentum, that we succeeded in something in Tax the Rich, in forcing Cuomo to do that he really didn't want to do. It wasn't everything we went out for, but this is politics, and it's more than anyone had done in the past, 12 years or whatever. And so that New York could lead the way for the nation, and that healthcare organizers and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party within New York could lead the way for the rest of us, the party. And that's our big picture strategy. Next slide. If you want to get more involved, we have a couple of events left in our week of action. Tomorrow we're canvassing at Grand Army Plaza at 1 p.m. and there will be a socially distanced party at the Picnic House in Prospect Park at 3. Come meet some comrades and drink seltzer and eat snacks and drink beer and take a breather. Yes, woohoo. It's been a long week. Sunday, we have a digital town hall featuring Julia Salazar at 1 p.m. It'll be a big event with politicians and organizers speaking and talking about where we are and where we're going and actually connecting people to get directly more involved. If you have a sense of, hey, I want to do this, but what should I be doing? That's a great thing to do. For the rest of those, we have Action Network links. And you could also go to our bit.ly, bit.ly, NYC-DSA Health. That is for this overall campaign, not just the New York City. Our Slack has a special channel for statewide coordinating and for doing this. So if you are not in the greater New York City area, or not even in downstate area, still please join our Slack. And finally, of course, we never can forget the most important goal of socialism is raising money from the workers. So if you have a little extra to spare, donate to our chest. Might be cut off on my screen, but we'll throw that in the chat. Okay, next slide is pretty pointless, but here it is. Q&A. If anyone has questions, we have answers. I don't really have anything else. And so I put in a very lovely picture of a sheep. Like, he's very fluffy, and the guy sitting next to him is like, yes, the sheep is fluffy. I'm not terribly impressed with it, which I don't understand why. Great. So if anyone has questions, I'm happy to take them. If not, I can throw some of those links into the chat. And yeah.
So, Harvey, I have a question for you. After your history lesson, do you think is there any lesson we can learn from history at this particular moment that we can apply in New York right now?
Harvey,
You're
you're
muted.
muted.
You're muted.
Shame on me. Okay. Well, I mean, for a start, I think that the foremost, well, first of all, I hesitate to talk about lessons of history, but I do think it's important to realize that I think Americans actually do carry around a kind of deep cultural memory, a deep sense of what it means to be an American, which is admittedly going to be filled with a lot of contradictions. But I think it's the case that, it's going to sound funny. I remember when I turned 50, and I guess I was unsettled by the experience. And I walked into a big introductory lecture course that day where I had essentially 18 to 20-year-olds. And I just wanted to sort of talk out loud. And in the middle of doing this, to what it meant, as to what it meant to be 50. And all of a sudden it dawned on me, I said, you know, one of the things you'll discover as you get older is that whether you like it or not, you're going to end up sounding like one or both of your parents. And I said that we really shouldn't be too surprised, but I then jumped into a larger historical kind of question. And I said, if you took, say, 5 or 7 of me and laid me head to toe as if I was going deep into the past 50 to 70 years at a time, we weren't maybe more than 5 of me, and we were back in the time of the American Revolution. It wasn't that many, it was even less to get me back to the Civil War, back into the 30s. What I was trying to get to them is that if we're likely to sound like our parents, then why would we assume that generations don't layer themselves within us? This isn't mystical, this is a serious material question. So I think what we should try to understand is that when we talk to people about healthcare, about universal healthcare, when we talk to them and sort of explain to them how it's naturally a part of what we think of as social security, that they won't necessarily respond in as alien a fashion as we might expect. So, I mean, young people have parents and grandparents who are likely taking advantage of Medicare, Medicaid. They know people are on Social Security. What I'm getting at, and all the more if you're in New York City, I think, but I can tell you that even here in Wisconsin, people actually carry around this kind of historical memory or deep cultural memory, which means you actually can speak to them and not actually necessarily have to argue with them. You may have to argue with part of what they're thinking, but you could actually engage the better part of their thinking, or the good sense out of the common sense. So that's not a lesson of history. The other lesson of history is that had it not been for people actively pursuing the notion of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to make it real, you wouldn't have had the kinds of transformations that have occurred in American history. And I'll go one step further, which is a whole thesis of mine, and that is that Americans are fundamentally radicals at heart, which goes way, way back. And the best example I can give you of that is not to recite the whole radical tradition and its story, but to tell you that at times of really the worst crises in American history, the only way that we somehow found it in ourselves to transcend those crises by radically transforming the nation, whether it had to do with the ending of slavery in the course of the Civil War and all of the social democratic initiatives that came along with it that Lincoln signed into law, or the 1930s and the 1940s. Those were not just victories over crises. Those were actually witnessing radical transformations of America. Now, we are right now, I would argue, and I've been saying this for quite a few years, but I think it became all the more true in the wake of Trump, on top of that, the pandemic, that we are in a crisis not incomparable to the 1860s and the 1930s. Okay, and this was true even before Trump and the pandemic, given the utter incredibly gross inequalities, the vast number of people who, in a nation that had once thought of itself as the premier middle-class nation, how many millions of Americans were living on the edge in a marginal way. I mean, the kinds of things that Jenny showed us is telling about the fact that our, the age span of Americans, the moments of death are basically, we've been screwing ourselves, and more of us are dying younger than ever before. Okay, I mean, that should tell you something. Okay, so I think what we want to do is, and that's why I was willing to do this, because I don't know if I could tell anyone this proves this, but I do think that it should make us fairly hopeful. I hesitate to use the word optimistic because we can get a bit too much on that, but it should make us really hopeful that this is the time that healthcare can become a universal in New York State and in the nation, despite the opposition, despite the filibuster and all of that. And it may well be that it has to happen at the state levels. Look, I mean, and by the way, once something happens, there's no guarantees it'll ever remain. Wisconsin was the first state in the union. The state, I grew up in the New York area, but I'm in Wisconsin now for 43 years. Wisconsin was the first state in the union to sign into law, enact a law that guaranteed public employees collective bargaining, organizing, and collective bargaining rights. And then, of course, in 2011, Walker and the Republicans literally hijacked, the state and stripped us of our collective bargaining rights. We can have a union, but we can't bargain collectively. So there's no guarantees, but it's also the case that we know that change is possible. Maybe in my lifetime, I was witness to too many good things, so I remain hopeful. And I see this moment. I can tell you 2 weeks ago when somebody told me the situation in the New York legislature, I was blown away. I mean, I was absolutely blown away to think that you have majority of members of each house endorsing this possibility. though as was expressed in the presentation, you have to get them to be enthusiastic about it. But once you've gotten them on, on paper, you've already conquered most of the mountain. So I don't know, that probably doesn't answer your question, but that's just the sense I have of what history tells us.
Well, if I were to boil that down to a reductionist lesson that you avoid, I would say that if extreme inequality is fertile ground for radical transformation, New York State is about as good as it gets right now.
Yeah.
Okay, now I have